Okay, second video, chapter 1, House of Seven Gables. I'm going to try to move faster because I know that first video was super long, but again, this is to explain it to you, so sometimes these take long. Again, you don't have to listen to me read it. You can listen to someone else read it, but you need to make sure you understand it. Okay, so just as a quick recap, Colonel Pynchon just died. Colonel Pynchon's sudden and mysterious end made a vast deal of noise in its day. There were many rumors, some of which were vaguely drifted down to the present time, how the appearance indicated violence, that there were the marks of fingers on his throat, and the print of a bloody hand on his plaited ruff like his collar, and that his peaked beard was disheveled, as if it had been fiercely clutched and pulled. It was averred, likewise, that the lattice window near the colonel's chair was open, and that only a few minutes before the fatal occurrence, the figure of a man had been seen clambering over the garden fence in the rear of the house. But it were folly, meaning it's kind of dumb, to lay any stress on stories of this kind, which are sure to spring up around such an event as that now related, and which, as in the present case, sometimes prolongs themselves for ages afterwards. Meaning it's dumb to put stock in old spooky stories that of course are going to go on, last forever. Everybody loves a good ghost story. Like the toadstools that indicate where the fallen and buried trunk of a tree has long since moldered into the earth. For our own part, we allow them just as little credence as to that other fable of the skeleton hand which the lieutenant governor was said to have seen at the colonel's throat. So, I love how he just throws this in passing. Supposedly, the lieutenant governor saw a skeleton hand like choking the governor. Or, I'm sorry, Colonel Pynchon. But which vanished away as he advanced farther into the room. Certain it is, however, that there was a great consultation and dispute of doctors over the dead body. One John Swinnerton by name, who appears to have been a man of eminence, upheld it, if we have rightly understood his terms of art, to be a case of apoplexy. Okay, so I had to look up apoplexy. I don't know if you guys can see the dictionary. I should have checked that since the last video. But essentially, it is a brain hemorrhage, a cerebral hemorrhage or stroke. So one doctor says that he died of a cerebral hemorrhage or stroke. His professional brethren, meaning like the other professionals besides that one doctor or other doctors, each for himself adopted various hypotheses, more or less plausible, but all dressed out in a perplexing mystery of phrase, which, if it did not show a bewilderment of mind in these erudite physicians, certainly causes it in the unlearned peruser of other opinions. The coroner's jury sat upon the corpse, and, like sensible men, returned an unassailable verdict of sudden death. So that's what they say killed him in the end, was sudden death. Meaning they don't know, he just died suddenly. It is indeed difficult to imagine that there could have been a serious suspicion of murder, or the slightest grounds for implicating any particular individual as the perpetrator. The rank, wealth, and eminent character of the deceased must have ensured the strictest scrutiny into every ambiguous circumstance, meaning it's not believable that he was murdered because he's such a well-to-do, well-known, high-ranking, super wealthy person, that they would, it's surely, looking back on it, they would have investigated this to its fullest, is what he means. So we can, according to the narrator, we can disregard the idea of murder because they would have heavily investigated it because of his rank. As none such is on record, it is safe to assume that none existed, meaning no suspicion of murder. Tradition, again, passing down by word of mouth, which sometimes bring down truth that history has let slip, but is oftener the wild babble of the time, meaning, again, not trustworthy. Such as was formerly spoken at the fireside and now congeals in newspapers, tradition is responsible for all contrary averments. In Colonel Pynchon's funeral sermon, which was printed and is still extant, meaning you can still view it, The Reverend Mr. Higginson enumerates among the many felicities of his distinguished parishioner's earthly career. So he goes on and on about the great, wonderful things that Colonel Pynchon did. The happy seasonableness of his death, his duties all performed and highest prosperity attained, his race and future generations fixed on a stable basis, and with a stately roof to shelter them for centuries to come. What other upward step remained for this good man to take, save the final step, from earth to the golden gate of heaven? The pious clergyman surely would not have uttered words like these had he in the least suspected that the colonel had been thrust into the other world with a clutch of violence upon his throat. So this is all kind of just suspect in a weird way. The narrator, on one hand, really pushes forth the idea that there's no way that Colonel Pynchon could have been murdered. But on another hand, he's really sarcastic, almost satiric in his wording. Like here, there's no way that the clergyman would have said all these great things if the Colonel Pynchon had in fact been murdered. So it's like a weird, again, dichotomy. There's no way he could have been murdered, but yeah, maybe he was murdered. Who knows? The family of Colonel Pynchon at the epoch of his death, so at the time of his death, seemed destined to as fortunate a permanence as can anywise consist with the inherent instability of human affairs. It might fairly be anticipated that the progress of time would rather increase and ripen their prosperity than wear away and destroy it. For not only had his son and heir come into immediate enjoyment of a rich estate, but there was a claim through an Indian deed, confirmed by a subsequent grant of general accord, to a vast and as yet unexplored and unmeasured tract of eastern lands. So here he essentially says that basically his family should be really well set up, because not only do they inherit this land, but they also have inherited this other area of land. Remember, it's right next to the mall land, or what was the mall land, that it hasn't been, nothing's been done with it. It's still open wilderness. And so there's a lot of possibilities, a lot of money to be made there. You can sell it off, all this kind of stuff, and that they should get that land. These possessions, for as such they might almost certainly be reckoned, comprise the great part of what is now known as Waldo County in the state of Maine, and were more extensive than many a dukedom, or even a reigning prince's territory on European soil, when the pathless forest that still covered this wild principality should give place, as it inevitably must, though perhaps not till ages hence, to the golden fertility of human culture, meaning the land may not be worth much now because it's covered in the forest and woods, trees, all that stuff, but in the future, inevitably, it will be worth a lot, and it will be sold for a lot. And give them, as he put it, golden fertility, right? The human culture will take the land up when the Pynchons sell it or rent it out and charge tax fees. They can make a lot of money off of it. It would be the source of incalculable wealth to the Pynchon blood. Had the colonel survived only a few weeks longer, it is probable that his great political influence and powerful connections at home and abroad would have consummated all that was necessary to render the claim available. But, in spite of Mr. Good Higginson's congratulatory eloquence, that was the preacher, remember? The clergyman, this appeared to be the one thing which Colonel Pynchon, provident and sagacious as he was, had allowed to go at loose ends. So he had not taken, Colonel Pynchon had not sealed up the deal with getting the adjacent land, the land next to Maul's land. He did not have that yet, fully. He had made a claim on it and said that it was his, but he did not fully have the deed to that land. Remember, the land that was going to be worth so much money. So far as the prospective territory was concerned, he unquestionably died too soon. His son lacked not merely the father's eminent position, but the talent and force of character to achieve it. He could therefore effect nothing but dint of political interest, and the bare justice or legality of the claim was not so apparent. So with his son, it falls by the wayside, right? This land that's worth, they still have the house and they have the mall land, but the land that was going to be worth so much money, their claim is not quite so solid because Colonel Pynchon didn't, kind of finish it out. And his son, yeah, not such a strong guy. After the colonel's decease, as it had been pronounced in his lifetime, some connecting link had slipped out of evidence and could not anywhere be found. So they have this claim to the land, but they have no way to prove it. Efforts, it is true, were made by the Pynchons, not only then, but at various periods for nearly 100 years afterwards, to obtain what they stubbornly persisted in deeming their right. Of course, this is ironic, right? Because if you remember, Matthew Maule claimed his land that the Pynchons took his right. But in course of time, the territory was partly regranted to more favored individuals and partly cleared and occupied by actual settlers. These last, if they ever heard of the Pynchon title, would have laughed at the idea of any man's asserting a right on the strength of moldy parchments signed with faded autographs of governors and legislators long dead and forgotten, to the lands which they or their fathers had wrested from the wild hand of nature by their own sturdy toil. This impalpable claim, therefore, resulted in nothing more solid than to cherish from generation to generation an absurd delusion of family importance, which all along characterized the Pynchons. This is a really important quote. If you're in honors and you're listening to this, you should highlight this. So our whole theme, and even in dual, if you're listening to this, our whole theme this year is the idea of fantasy, right? Of how powerful fantasy is. This idea of a delusion, of a belief that's not real. It directly connects to the idea of fantasy, of what is fantasy versus what is fiction. What is the making of our own mind versus what is real, what is legit. And here he solidly tells you that this idea of living in this kind of delusional fantasy world heavily characterizes the Pynchons. Not just Hepzibah, who you will meet in the coming chapters, or Clifford, her brother, who you'll actually see him some in this chapter, but the whole family kind of heavily lives in this fantasy world of their own importance. It has caused the poorest member of the race, meaning the Pynchons, to feel as if he inherited a kind of nobility, and might yet come into the possession of princely wealth to support it. In the better specimens of the breed, this peculiarity threw an ideal grace over the hard material of human life, without stealing away any true valuable quality. In the baser sort, its effect was to increase the liability to sluggishness, meaning laziness, and dependence, and induce the victim of a shadowy hope to remit all self-effort, meaning they don't do anything for themselves. They just live under this fantasy, this delusion of it'll come to me because I'm so important. It'll happen to me because I'm so important, while awaiting the realization of his dreams. Years and years after their claim had passed out of the public memory, the Pynchons were accustomed to consult the colonel's ancient map, which had been projected while Waldo County was still an unbroken wilderness, where the old land surveyor had put down woods, lakes, and rivers. They marked out the cleared spaces and dotted the villages and towns, and calculated the progressively increasing value of the territory, as if there was yet a prospect of it ultimately forming a princedom for themselves. In almost every generation, nevertheless, there happened to be some one descendant of the family gifted with a portion of the hard, keen sense and practical energy that had some remarkably distinguished the original founder. So again, keep in mind there's been a lot of time passed, right? So we haven't heard about all the descendants between Colonel Pynchon, his son, and who we're about to get to, okay? His character, indeed, might be traced all the way down as distinctly as if the colonel himself, a little deluded, had been gifted with a sort of intermittent immortality on earth. At 2 or 3 epochs, meaning like 2 or 3 eras. Now, this is not clear how long that is. That could be decades, centuries, possibly. Epic is an era, okay? When the fortunes of the family were low, this representative of the hereditary qualities had made his appearance and caused the traditionary gossips of the town to whisper among themselves, "Here is the old Pynchon come again." Now the Seven Gables will be new shingled. Just meaning that a great ancestor of Colonel Pynchon periodically showed up within the line, meaning somebody who had his same demeanor, his same attitude, his same like stalwart, I'm going to claim everything and I'm going to bring us back into greatness, would appear within the family ancestry or the family line. And when that person appeared, the town folk would be like, oh, it's like Colonel Pynchon come again. It's like his ghost. From father to son, they clung to the ancestral house with singular tenacity of a home attachment. So regardless, throughout the years, they never let go of the house of Seven Gables. For various reasons, however, and from impressions often too vaguely founded to be put on paper, the writer cherishes the belief that many, if not most, of the successive proprietors of the estate were troubled with doubts as to their moral right to hold it. So our narrator speaks of himself in the fourth person right here. Right? Or sorry. Yeah. No. I said that backwards. In the third person. I'm sorry about that. I said fourth person because breaking the fourth wall. Anyway, tangent. The writer speaks of himself in the third person. So our narrator is the writer, right? Cherishes the belief that many, if not most, of the successive proprietors of this estate were troubled with doubts to their moral right to hold it. So essentially, our narrator is saying that he likes to believe that the Pynchon family, at least some point, if not all of them, any of them who lived in the house, questioned or doubted, like morality wise, meaning like what's good, what's right, their ownership to the home. Now, again, this could all fall back on Hawthorne himself, because remember, the narrator is not the same thing as the actual writer. Yes, I know it's a little bit confusing here because you say, oh, the writer. Well, Hawthorne has created a weird thing here. In his story, the narrator refers to himself oftentimes as the writer. That does not mean that Hawthorne is in the story, okay? And we'll talk more about who the narrator is as we go along, or who he could be. Anyway, it does fall back to Hawthorne in his past, though, and the idea of him questioning his ancestors with the Salem witch trials and all that kind of stuff. Of their legal tenure, there could be no question, but old Matthew Mall, it is to be feared, trod downward from his own age to a far latter one, planting a heavy footstep all the way on the conscience of a Pynchon. If so, we are left to dispose of the awful query. That's a question. Whether each inheritor of the property, conscious of wrong and failing to rectify it, meaning failing to make the wrong right, so to speak, did not commit anew the great guilt of his ancestor. So essentially, they know their family did wrong. They do nothing about it. So because they do nothing about it, are they in turn once again, like, I don't know how else to say it, once again committing the same crime all over again and incur all its original responsibilities, meaning when they commit that same crime all over again, they incur the curse. They take on the curse. And supposing such to be the case, would not be a far truer mode of expression to say of the Pynchon family that they inherited a great misfortune than the reverse, meaning than the Malls did. We have already hinted that it is not our purpose to trace down the history of the Pynchon family. Ironic, because that's almost what he did. In its unbroken connection with the House of the Seven Gables. Nor to show, as in a magic picture, how the rustiness and infirmity of age gathered over the venerable house itself. As regards its interior life, a large dim-looking glass used to hang in one of the rooms, and was fabled to contain within its depths all the shapes that had ever been reflected there, a looking-glass meaning a mirror. The old colonel himself and his many descendants, some in the garb of antique babyhood, and others in the bloom of feminine beauty or manly prime, or saddened within the wrinkles of frosty age. Had we the secret of the mirror, we would gladly sit down before it and transfer its revelations to our page. But there was a story for which it is difficult to conceive any foundation, that the posterity of Matthew Mall, meaning like his fortune, his wealth, what he attains in life, right? The posterity of Matthew Mall, had some connection with the mystery of the looking glass, and that by what appears to have been a sort of magic process, they could make its inner region all alive with the departed pensions, not as they had shown themselves to the world, nor in their better and happier hours, but as doing over again some deed of sin or in the crisis of life's bitterest sorrows. Essentially, he's implying that the curse kind of follows them in the afterlife. So the mirror shows the family, if I can get that to go, not in their happier hours, but reliving a sin or a terrible thing over and over again. When we get to for Duel, when we get to Dante's Inferno, this will definitely have a connection there. But it definitely is this idea of they're being punished not just here in the everyday normal world, but even in the afterlife. The popular imagination, indeed, long kept itself busy with the affair of the old Puritan pension and wizard Mall. The curse, which the latter flung from his scaffold, was remembered with the very important addition that it had become a part of the pension inheritance. If one of the family did but gurgle in his throat, a bystander would be likely enough to whisper between jest and earnest, just as a joke, "He has Mall's blood to drink." The sudden death of a pension about 100 years ago, with circumstances very similar to what had been related of the colonel's exit, was held as giving additional probability to the received opinion on this topic. It was considered, moreover, an ugly and ominous circumstance that Colonel Pynchon's picture, in obedience, it was said, to a provision of his will, remained affixed to the wall of the room in which he died. So because of his will, like instructions in his will, Colonel Pynchon's picture still hangs in his study where it did originally. Those stern, immitigable features seem to symbolize an evil influence, and so darkly to mingle the shadow of their presence with the sunshine of the passing hour that no good thoughts or purpose could ever spring up and blossom there. To the thoughtful mind, there will be no tinge of superstition in what we figuratively express, by affirming that the ghost of a dead progenitor, perhaps a progenitor is like an owner or originator, perhaps as a portion of his own punishment, is often doomed to become the evil genius of his family. All this long-windedness to just say that the curse follows the family. It didn't just die, superstitious-wise anyway, with Colonel Pynchon. Even in their real lives, in their afterlives, it follows them. The Pynchons, in brief, lived along for the better part of 2 centuries, with perhaps less of outward vicissitude than has attended most other New England families during the same period of time, meaning they weren't really socialites in the world, that outward vicissitude. They didn't socialize a lot with the community. They kind of kept to themselves. Possessing very distinctive traits of their own, they nevertheless took the general characteristics of the little community in which they dwelt. A town noted for its frugal, discreet, well-ordered, and home-loving inhabitants, as well as for the somewhat confined scope of its sympathies, but in which, be it said, there are odder individuals, and now and then stranger occurrences than one meets with almost everywhere else. Meaning all this is really strange, but there's other stuff that's even weirder. During the Revolution, the pension of that epoch, of that era, so a lot of time has passed, right? Adopting the royal side, meaning they went with with England. They didn't side with the colonists. They sided with England. Became a refugee, but repented and made his reappearance just at the point of time to preserve the house of the Seven Gables from confiscation. For the last 70 years, the most noted event in the Pynchon annals, like their history, had been likewise the heaviest calamity that ever befell the race, no less than the violent death, for so it was adjudged of one member of the family by the criminal act of another. So, again, we've got a huge gap here, right? A huge gap in time. And one member of the family commits a criminal act against another. In a sense, they try to kill the other one. Certain circumstances attending this fatal occurrence had brought the deed irresistibly home to the nephew of the deceased Pynchon. Okay? So, the young man was tried and convicted of the crime. But either the circumstantial nature of the evidence and possibly some lurking doubt in the breast of the executive, or lastly, an argument of greater weight in a republic than it could have been under a monarchy, the high respectability and political influence of the criminal's connections had availed to mitigate his doom from death to perpetual imprisonment. So essentially, years pass, and one of the pensions, okay, tries to kill one of the older pensions. You don't know who yet. You'll learn in a minute. And when this man tries to kill, or does he try to kill, or does he actually kill him? Oh, he kills him. When this man kills the older pension, he is tried for the crime, and he's not executed, but he is imprisoned. This sad affair had chanced about 30 years before the action of our story. So the story is going to open up 30 years after that person was imprisoned. Latterly, there were, I know I skipped the word commences, but latterly there were rumors, which few believed and only one or two felt greatly interested in, that this long buried man, buried meaning he's not literally buried, right? But it was very common at the time that this book was written and before it, that if you went to prison for life, you were never going to get out. Like there was no parole, so to speak. And so they would consider you a dead man, even if you weren't really dead. So they often referenced you as being a buried man. So this long buried man was likely, for some reason or other, to be summoned forth from his living tomb. So it was believed that at some point, this man that was convicted of murdering his heir, the pension heir, like the pension elder, that he would at some point be released from prison. It is essential to say a few words respecting the victim of this now almost forgotten murder. He was an old bachelor and possessed of great wealth, in addition to the house and real estate which constituted what remained of the ancient pension property. Being of an eccentric and melancholy turn of mind, and greatly given to rummaging old records and hearkening to old traditions, he had brought himself, it is averred, to the conclusion that Matthew Mall, the wizard, had been foully wronged out of his homestead. So the guy that was murdered had, after rummaging through all these old files and stuff, had essentially decided that the house of Seven Gables didn't belong to the pensions, that it belonged to the Malls, that everything that happened was not right. Such being the case, and he, the old bachelor, in possession of the ill-gotten spoil, with the black stain of blood sunken deep into it, and still to be scented by conscientious nostrils, the question occurred whether it were not imperative upon him, even at this late hour, so even after all these years, to make restitution to Mall's posterity, meaning he feels the need to reach out to the Mall family and to give back to them, to repay them for the land they took. To a man living so much in the past and so little in the present, as the secluded and antiquarian old bachelor, a century and a half seemed not so vast a period as to the obviate the propriety of substantiating right for wrong. It was the belief of those who knew him best that he would positively have taken the very singular step of giving up the house of the Seven Gables to the representative of Matthew Mall, but for the unspeakable tumult which a suspicion of the old gentleman's project awakened among his pension relatives. So essentially, the old bachelor who was murdered, the pension, who they don't give you his name, he's going to give the house and all the land back to the Malls. And it is commonly believed that he would have done so, except he was murdered. Their exertions had the effect of suspending his purpose, meaning the fact that they murdered him did away with that. But it was feared that he would perform after death by the operation of his last will what he had so heartily been prevented from doing in his proper lifetime. But there is no one thing which men so rarely do, whatever the provocation or inducement, as to bequeath patrimonial property away from their own blood. So essentially after he's murdered, which again, you don't know who murdered him yet, you just know that it was a relative of his, okay? But that same relative believed that this elder pension, this bachelor pension, might have left the land in his will to the Malls. But then the narrator says, but you know what? Nobody does that. It's rarely done. Men so rarely do whatever they say they're going to do in life, especially when it comes to patrimonial property. Patrimonial is referencing the idea of property being passed from one father, one male heir to another. Okay? So the idea of him giving away that property to someone other than his own blood, it just wasn't done. They may love other individuals far better than their relatives. They may even cherish dislike or positive hatred to the latter. But yet, meaning they may even completely dislike or hate their relatives. But yet, in view of death, the strong prejudice of propinquity revives and impels the testator to send down his estate in the line marked out by custom. So, it's always been done this way. The idea of passing it on to your son, it'll always be done that way. So immemorial that it looks like nature. In all the pensions, this feeling had the energy of disease. It was too powerful, meaning they were so overcome with this idea of tradition. It's always been done this way. It was too powerful for the conscientious scruples of the old bachelor, at whose death, accordingly, the mansion house, together with most of his other riches, passed into possession of his next legal representative. Obviously, it's not going to go to the pension that tried to kill him, right? That pension is in prison. The one it goes to is this was a nephew, the cousin of the miserable young man who had been convicted of the uncle's murder. So both of them were nephews. The new heir, up to the period of his accession, was reckoned rather a dissipated youth, but had at once reformed and made himself an exceedingly respectable member of society. In fact, he showed more of the pension quality and had won higher eminence in the world than any of his race since the time of the original Puritan. So this new heir, this nephew of the murdered uncle, okay, what had achieved a higher rank than any of his ancestors since the original Colonel pension, okay? Applying himself in earlier manhood to the study of law and having a natural tendency towards office, he had attained many years ago to a judicial situation in some inferior court, which gave him for life the very desirable and imposing title of judge. Later, he had engaged in politics and served a part of 2 terms in Congress, besides making a considerable figure in both branches of the state legislature. Judge Pension was unquestionably an honor to his race. He had built himself a country seat within a few miles of his native town, and there spent such portions of his time as could be spared from public service and the display of every grace and virtue. It's ironic, right? Sounds a lot like Colonel Pension, right? And when I say country seat, that just means he holds an office as a judge in this sense, but an office in the country, not in the city. That's what they mean by it. I was trying to delete that, but I give up. Befitting the Christian, okay. As a newspaper phrased it, on the eve of an election befitting the Christian, the good citizen, the horticulturalist, which is just like somebody who deals with plants, flowers, that kind of things, and the gentleman, there were few of the pensions left to sun themselves in the glow of the judge's prosperity. In respect to natural increase, the breed had not thriven. It appeared, meaning there weren't a lot of pensions left, right? It appeared rather to be dying out. The only members of the family known to be extant were, first, the judge himself, and a single surviving son who was now traveling in Europe. Next, the 30 years prisoner, so the judge's cousin, right? That was the nephew that killed his uncle that, was also the judge's uncle that's in prison, already alluded to, and a sister of the latter. So the 30 years prisoner, the The nephew that killed his uncle, who is the cousin of the judge, right? The nephew that's in prison, he has a sister who occupied in an extremely retired manner the house of Seven Gables, in which she had a life estate by the will of the old bachelor. What that means, a life estate, okay, so, women had no rights, right, at this time at all. At all. They could not own, they were property, literally. But she, because of the will of the guy who was murdered, she is allowed to live in the house until she dies. She doesn't own the house, okay? But she's allowed to live in it until she dies. She was understood to be wretchedly poor and seemed to make it her choice to remain so, inasmuch as her affluent cousin, the judge, had repeatedly offered her all comforts of life. So the judge had tried to help her financially, but she had refused it, either in the old mansion or his own modern residence. The last and youngest pension was a little country girl of 17, the daughter of another of the judge's cousins, who had married a young woman of no family or property and died early and in poor circumstance. This little country girl of 17, you will meet her later, right? So just to give you a rundown, because it's already confusing, and you can write this down if you want. So you have the judge. His name is Judge Jaffrey, it's with an A, Pension. And then you also have the prisoner, the 30 years prisoner. That is Clifford. Clifford is the brother and the cousin. He's the cousin of the judge, of Judge Jaffrey Pension. And he's the brother of Hephzibah. Hephzibah is going to be our main character. Remember, Hephzibah is the one who's allowed to live in the house until she dies. They all have another cousin who is 17, and that is Phoebe. You will be introduced to her later. Who had married a young woman of no family. The daughter of another of the judge's cousins, who had married a young woman of no family or property and died early and in poor circumstances. His widow had recently taken another husband. As for Matthew Mall's posterity, it was supposed now to be extinct. For a very long period after the witchcraft delusion, however, the Malls had continued to inhabit the town, where their progenitor, that meaning their father, Matthew Mall, had suffered so unjust a death. To all appearance, they were a quiet, honest, well-meaning race of people, cherishing no malice against individuals or public for the wrong which had been done them. Or if at their own fireside they transmitted from father to child any hostile recollection of the wizard's fate and their lost patrimony, it was never acted upon, meaning their lost inheritance from their father, nor openly expressed. Nor would it have been singular had they ceased to remember that the house of Seven Gables was resting its heavy framework on a foundation that was rightfully their own. There is something so massive, stable, and almost irresistibly imposing in the exterior presentment of established rank and great possessions that their very existence seems to give them a right to exist. Such a good quote. Sorry. Meaning, you reach a pinnacle, think like superstars, right? Famous people, right? There's something so there's just such an aura and so much power perceived, not necessarily real power, but perceived power around this famous, eminent person that it's I don't know, they just have all these rights that you believe they have that they don't, but you believe they do. At least so excellent a counterfeit of right that few poor and humble men have moral force enough to question it, even in their secret minds. Such is the case now after so many ancient prejudices have been overthrown, and it was far more so in anti-revolutionary days when the aristocracy could venture to be proud and the low were content to be abased, meaning put down. They didn't care. The revolution was over. They were just glad the war was over. Thus the Malls, at all events, kept their resentments within their own breast, within their own heart, to themselves. They were generally poverty-stricken, always plebeian and obscure, meaning always lower class, tradesmen, workers, and obscure meaning nobody noticed them, working with unsuccessful diligence at handicrafts, laboring on the wharves, or following the sea as sailors before the mast, living here and there about the town in hired tenements, and coming finally to the almshouse, which is like a bar, as the natural home of their old age. At last, I said that wrong. The almshouse, like I'm trying to think of how to describe it. A place where the public, like a shelter to live in if you're poor. At last, after creeping, as it were, for such a length of time, sorry, alarm, along the utmost verge of the opaque puddle of obscurity, they had taken their downright plunge, which sooner or later is the destiny of all families, meaning eventually all families' demise, period, whether princely or plebeian. For 30 years past, neither town record, nor gravestone, nor the directory, nor the knowledge or memory of man bore any trace of Matthew Mall's descendants. His blood might possibly exist elsewhere. Here, where its lowly current could be traced so far back, it had ceased to keep an onward course. So long as any of the race were to be found, they had been marked out from other men, not strikingly, nor as with a sharp line, but with an effect that was felt rather than spoken of by an hereditary character of reserve, meaning they didn't speak out enough for themselves, so they just kind of fell by the wayside. Their companions, or those who endeavored to become such, grew conscious of a circle around about the malls, within the sanctity or the spell of which, in spite of an exterior of sufficient frankness and good fellowship, it was impossible for any man to step. It was this indefinable peculiarity, perhaps, that by insulting them from human aid, kept them always so unfortunate in life. It certainly operated to prolong, in their case, and to confirm to them as their only inheritance those feelings of repugnance and superstitious terror with which the people of the town, even after awakening from their frenzy, continued to regard the memory of their reputed witches. The mantle, or rather the ragged cloak of old Matthew Mall, had fallen upon his children. So just like Pynchon, Matthew Mall's, like what he did in his past, his curse had fallen to his children the same way, right? They were half believed to inherit mysterious attributes. The family eye was said to possess strange power. Among other good-for-nothing properties and privileges, one was especially assigned them, that of exercising an influence over people's dreams. The Pynchons, if all stories were true, haughtily, as they bore themselves in the noonday streets of their native town, were no better than bond-servants to these plebeian malls, meaning the malls cursed them, owned them, on entering the topsy-turvy commonwealth of sleep. Modern psychology, it may be, will endeavor to reduce these alleged necromancies within a system instead of rejecting them as altogether fabulous. A descriptive paragraph or two treating of the Seven Gabled mansion in its more recent aspect will bring this preliminary chapter to a close. Finally, the street in which it upreared its venerable peaks has long ceased to be a fashionable quarter of the town, meaning at the time when the house was built, it was a very like high-end, really fashionable, like everybody wanted to be there end of town, but it was no longer that way. So that, though the old edifice was surrounded by habitations of modern date, they were mostly small, built entirely of wood, and typical of the most plodding uniformity of common life. Doubtless, however, the whole story of human existence may be latent in each of them, but with no picturesqueness externally that can attract the imagination or sympathy to seek it there. But as for the old structure of our story, its white oak frame and its boards, shingles, and crumbling plaster, and even the huge clustered chimney in the midst, seem to constitute only the least and meanest part of its reality. So much of mankind's varied experience had passed there. So much had been suffered and something too enjoyed, that the very timbers were oozy, as with the moisture of a heart, meaning like, again, this idea that the house is like a living being. It was itself like a great human heart with a life of its own and full of rich and somber reminiscences, memories. The deep projection of the second story gave of the house such a meditative look that you could not pass it without the idea that it had secrets to keep and an eventual history to moralize upon, In front, just on the edge of a paved sidewalk, grew the pension elm, again your elm, which, in reference to such trees as one usually meets with, might well be termed gigantic. It had been planted by a great-grandson of the first pension, and though now fourscore years of age, fourscore, that's centuries, so 400 decades. 400 years of age. Ooh, that's an old tree. Or perhaps nearer 100. Okay, again, unreliable narrator. Was still its strong and broad maturity, throwing its shadow from side to side of the street, overtopping the Seven Gables and sweeping the whole black roof with its pendant foliage. It gave beauty to the old edifice and seemed to make it a part of nature. The street having been widened about 40 years ago, the front gable was now precisely on a line with it. On either side extended a ruinous wooden fence of open lattice work, through which could be seen a grassy yard. I'm sorry, y'all. I'm so tired of reading, and I know you're tired of it too. I had to check to see when the end was. And especially in the angles of the building, an enormous fertility of burdocks, with leaves, it is hardly an exaggeration to say, 2 or 3 feet long. Behind the house there appeared to be a garden, which undoubtedly had once been extensive, but was now infringed upon by other enclosures, or shut in by habitations and outbuildings that stood on another street. It would be an omission, trifling indeed, but unpardonable, were we to forget the green moss that had long since gathered of the projections of the windows and on the slopes of the roof. Nor must we fail to direct the reader's eye to a crop, not of weeds, but flower shrubs, which were growing aloft in the air, not a great way from the chimney in the nook between two of the gables. They were called Alice's posies. The tradition was that a certain Alice Pyncheon had flung up the seeds in sport, and that the dust of the street and the decay of the roof gradually formed a kind of soil for them, out of which they grew. Again, you have this idea of what you pass down, you get in the future. Right? When Alice had long been in her grave, however the flowers might have come there, it was both sad and sweet to observe how nature adopted to herself this desolate, decaying, gusty, rusty old house of the Pyncheon family, and how the ever-returning summer did her best to gladden it with a tender beauty and grew melancholy in its effort. Okay, guys, I have to say, this has got to be an hour long or longer video. I'm going to stop it. I don't have that far to go. I really don't have that far to go. Oh. Okay, we're going to finish it. There is one other feature very essential to be noticed, but which we greatly fear may damage any picturesque and romantic impression which we have been willing to throw over our sketch of this respectable edifice, again house. In the front gable, under the impending brow of the second story and contiguous to the street, was a shop door. Okay, this is really important. Let me explain. So remember, the Pyncheons are aristocrats. They don't work. That's a thing with aristocrats, right? They don't do any kind of work. They don't do any kind of trade. They don't have to do that because they're aristocrats. It's part of the title and the glamour of being an aristocrat, if you will. Most of them made money off of land. They own land, and then they would either rent the land out to people that wanted to live and work the land, or they would both rent the land out and draw taxes from the land. That's how they made their money. So this is kind of like a smear on the house, right? The fact that there's there's this great aristocratic house that has a shop door in it. Imagine, this is a little hyperbolic, but imagine the idea of like the Queen's castle having a shop in which the Queen worked. Right? It's that kind of idea. That's a little hyperbolic, meaning exaggerated, but you get the idea. Divided horizontally in the midst, and with a window for its upper segment, such as is often seen in dwellings of a somewhat ancient date. The same shop door had been a subject of no slight mortification. Again, it's not a good thing, right? Mortification means like humiliation, embarrassment, to the present occupant of the august Pyncheon house, as well as to some of his predecessors. The matter is disagreeably delicate to handle, but since the reader must needs be let into the secret, meaning I gotta tell you the truth, he will please to understand that about a century ago, the head of the Pyncheons found himself involved in serious financial difficulties. The fellow, gentleman as he styled himself, meaning this is sarcastic. The narrator is saying like he didn't know how much of a gentleman he really was. Can hardly have been other than a spurious interloper. For instead of seeking office from the king or the royal governor or urging his hereditary claim to eastern lands, he remember that earlier claim, right, with the lands that they said they owned. He bethought himself of no better avenue to wealth than by cutting a shop door through the side of his ancestral residence. It was the custom of the time, indeed, for merchants to store their goods and transact business in their own dwellings, but there was something pitifully small in this old pension's mode of setting about his commercial operations. This is just the idea of like, it was kind of pathetic that he came down, to a rank beneath him. It was whispered that, with his own hands, all beruffled as they were, he used to give change for a shilling and would turn a halfpenny twice over to make sure that it was a good one. Beyond all question, he had the blood of a petty huckster in his veins, through whatever channel it may have found its way there. Immediately on his death, the shop door had been locked, bolted, and barred, and, down to the period of our story, had probably never once been opened. The old counter, shelves, and other fixtures of the little shop remained just as he had left them. It used to be affirmed that the dead shopkeeper in white wig, ironic, right? Because white, this is the idea of the aristocracy, a faded velvet coat, an apron at his waist, and his ruffles carefully turned back from his wrist, might be seen through the chinks of the shutters any night of the year, ransacking his till, or poring over the dingy pages of his daybook. This is like his log, like where he kept his daybook, where he kept his records about what he sold and how much money he made, that kind of stuff. From the look of unutterable woe upon his face, it appeared to be his doom to spend eternity in a vain effort to make his accounts balance. And now, in a very humble way, as will be seen, we proceed to open our narrative. So finally, let's get to the story of Hepzibah Pynchon. That will be the next video. I don't know if I'll do chapter 2. I might. It's a lot shorter. Doesn't look it, but I promise, or it felt like it was when I was reading it. But I definitely want to get you guys started. Hopefully you're at least starting to pick up on the story. And I'll see you in class.